I'm trying to explain how finance works to people, because there are a lot of people who understand peak oil or climate issues and a lot of the other challenges we face, and they look at sustainability in those terms. Not that many people understand how financial systems work, but it's absolutely critical that they do, because finance has a shorter time frame than everything else. And if you want to have a long term to worry about, you have to successfully negotiate the short term first. So this is something that I think is absolutely critical to bring to people's attention. So that's what I've been traveling around doing and putting in context with energy as well. For anyone who may be interested in where the name The Automatic Earth came from, it was from that particular song called The Boy in the Bubble by Paul Simon, for anyone who might be curious. And since we discuss bubbles all the time on our website, this seemed appropriate. So if I can make this work. And so what we're going to look at, broadly speaking, is global expansion and contraction on the largest scale, tying in with what Dr. Tainter was talking about earlier, and what are the key drivers over time. And there are a lot of drivers, but we're going to focus today on energy and finance, because those two things have the shortest time frame. So in financial terms, we're looking at deflation and depression. In energy terms, we're looking at an energy poor future in comparison to the life we have known for the last several decades at least. It really is going to be a century of challenges, and there's a lot more to it than merely energy and finance, but we don't have all day, so we're going to focus on those in this particular discussion. So to start with, energy is the master resource. Now, we're going to go over the energy work a little bit more quickly than I normally do, because you've already seen it from a number of other speakers, but energy is absolutely critical. There is no substitute for energy. You can use different forms of it, but if your gross amount of energy is declining, there is no substitute for that. You are going to have to face consequences as a result. Other societies have lived on an energy income, as Dr. Tainter was saying, I mean, with some ability to use accumulated energy reserves like firewood or grain or slaves from captured territories, but on the whole, that was an energy income existence in comparison to our existence, which has been based on an inheritance, a massive energy inheritance in the form of fossil fuels. We burn probably 400 years worth of the Earth's primary production every single year. But production from that inheritance is peaking because the inheritance is finite. And so, as we heard this morning, it's all about flow rates. You cannot continue to increase the flow rate indefinitely from a finite inheritance. And we have also complicated that by cherry picking our energy sources so that we have used the easy, cheap fraction to get at first, which is the very human thing to do. We now have the difficult and expensive fraction left. We probably still have half the oil or so there ever was still under the earth, but what we have left is the difficult, expensive fraction, and that has significant implications for flow rates, what it is possible to produce in any given year based on how much effort we have to put in to do it. And when I say that what we have left is the expensive fraction, I don't just mean in money terms, I mean in energy terms. So we are having to reinvest a significant amount of the energy we produce into the process of finding more energy. So we have less of it that's available as a surplus, our return on investment, to actually do anything with. And that is going to have major implications. So you saw this diagram this morning, basically simply to say that, look, when discoveries peaked, it's been dramatically downhill. When you hear about large discoveries now, they mean something of this order of magnitude, not that one. So these are not large discoveries by previous definitions. They might be a few months' worth of global consumption. But we are well down the discovery curve. Production has continued to rise, but is now essentially topping out, which is hardly surprising from what has happened to discovery. So there's the important concept of energy return on energy invested, as we heard this morning. So that is a measure of net energy. That's another term you would hear in relation to this. We used to have an energy return on energy invested for oil globally of perhaps 100 to 1. You put in 1 barrel's worth of oil of energy and you produce 100 in return. In the early days of the East Texas field or Saudi Arabia, it was rather equivalent to stick a straw in the ground and out comes a gusher. We're not in that world anymore. We're now at perhaps 10 to 1. The figures are debatable, but we're at perhaps 10 to 1 at the moment globally. Even in Saudi Arabia, they're doing an awful lot of tertiary recovery techniques and water flooding, and a lot of very sophisticated, very expensive extraction techniques are being used there. And this was previously one of the cheapest places in the world to produce oil. It is so no longer. We're now really being reduced to much more difficult supplies to extract. Things like the deep offshore or the Arctic. These are difficult environments to work in. Typically, the energy alternatives have even lower energy return on energy invested than oil currently does, often significantly so. And there is a minimum net energy required to run a civilization. 3 to 1 wouldn't actually get you our kind of civilization. 3 to 1 would get you something. We probably need not much less than the 10 to 1 we're looking at with oil at the moment in order to run our current level of society, because socioeconomic complexity is critically dependent on a supply of energy. Now, an important point to note about energy return on energy invested is once it has got down to 1, in other words, you would put in a barrel's worth of oil and you would get 1 out, then you no longer have an energy source. So it's not how much oil or coal or anything else is actually under the ground. The net energy is the critical factor, because once you get down to 1 to 1, it's over. You can't get it anymore. It doesn't matter how much is there, because the amount of energy you would have to put into getting it is often more than you would get from the process of doing so. So net energy is the critical determining factor of where the limits will lie, far more important than how much is actually under the surface of the earth. So we cannot avoid net energy. This is just to compare energy return on energy invested, or net energy, for a number of different sources, some of them over different time frames. So the blue ones can be harder to read. This is domestic oil 1930, domestic oil 1970, domestic oil today, by which they mean American. So this is imported oil today, imported oil in 1970. You can see what's been happening to energy return on energy invested for oil. But then compare that to a number of other sources. Really, imported oil is not that much better than domestic oil. The US is approximately 85% depleted in terms of its oil supplies now. Natural gas is not that much better. Hydro we have mostly already developed. The potential is there, but we have mostly brought that into production already. Nuclear is not great in terms of comparison with the minimum required for civilization. There are enormous costs to do with nuclear power. There are a lot of safety issues. As an academic, my field when I was at Oxford was nuclear safety in the Soviet Union in the context of social upheaval, socioeconomic upheaval, and the collapse process. And I can tell you that nuclear power and social upheaval are not compatible. Seriously bad things happen. Because nuclear power is a very, very complex activity that requires a lot of coordinated things to work properly. And that is far less likely to happen when you move into very, very difficult times. So it is absolutely no panacea. People who are looking at nuclear power and thinking, well, we'll just build reactors everywhere, there are many, many aspects to that future that they are not considering. Coal, well, there's an awful lot of coal. However, there are huge environmental consequences to using that, and if we substitute coal for the other uses that we currently have covered with oil and natural gas and other things, we will then see the energy return on energy invested of coal drop quite sharply. People always put things in terms of we have this amount of supply for this many years at current levels of consumption. If those levels of consumption change, that makes an enormous difference to the number of years of supply you have. We will use a lot more coal in the future. I think we will make a Faustian bargain, because if the alternative is to freeze in the dark, people don't like that. We are going to end up burning coal, but there will be significant consequences to doing so that we really need to be aware of. We need to think through what bargain we are making. But the really interesting part of this particular graph is down here. This is renewables. We don't have a whole lot of factories for producing solar panels and wind turbines. We can build them, but it takes time and it takes money. So you have to ramp up the productive capacity before you can ramp up the actual infrastructure for capturing energy in this way. And we are already living on borrowed time in terms of energy and in terms of finance. So we are going to have a very hard time ramping up the productive capacity and then the infrastructure in anything like the amount of time that we have available and with the money we will have available. And in any case, a lot of these alternatives have very, very low net energy. So the idea that you might be able to make wind turbines with wind energy or solar panels with solar energy is at the moment not a proven concept. So not only do you have difficulty ramping them up, but you still end up with a fossil fuel dependency to produce the infrastructure for renewable energy. So we have a lot of issues there. Plus, if you look at how low these are in terms of net energy, biofuels in particular, biofuels are scarcely above 1. Some of them are below. Ethanol is below 1. Ethanol is not an energy source. Producing ethanol from things like corn costs you energy. You do not produce energy in the process of creating corn ethanol, nor would you from cellulosic ethanol. You would, however, if you put that same feedstock that you would use for cellulosic ethanol, if you put that in an anaerobic digester, you will make energy out of it. You'll end up with a positive energy balance, but not in the case of cellulosic ethanol. Worst of all down here is tar sands. That's just an arbitrage between natural gas and syncrude, a liquid fuel. So we're destroying northern Alberta for the sake of creating a liquid fuel instead of a gaseous fuel. This is not an energy source. The energy returned on energy invested is abysmally low, and the cost of doing so is incredibly high. So just to look at this, it gives you a sense that we don't have a lot of easy answers out there, that we are not going to simply be able to say, well, we'll just use this. There is not the capacity to substitute in the way that people are currently thinking. We are absolutely going to have to make do with less. And this is an interesting comparison of curves. This is a gross Hubbert curve, the gray one, and a net Hubbert curve is the blue one. So the gray one, which is what you would mostly see if you've seen a Hubbert's curve before, is showing what happens to the decline of oil production over time. But that doesn't take into account the energy that you're putting back into the system to produce more energy. This blue curve does. So when people look at the gray Hubbert's curve and they say, well, you know, the decline rates are slow enough that we think we can compensate for that with a certain amount of efficiency investments in this kind of time frame, and we won't have to make any real adjustments to our standard of living. When you start looking at the kind of decline rate you get here, which does take account of the energy you're putting back into the system, it becomes obvious quite quickly that that simply isn't going to work. We are going to have to live a very different life. Business as usual is not going to be an option. So a few years ago, Mr. Cheney was saying, well, the American lifestyle is non-negotiable, to which I would say, that's true, because reality isn't going to negotiate with you. It's going to dictate. So business as usual is simply not going to be an option, because that kind of fall from this level of production to down here in the space of perhaps 20 years, that is not something you get over by changing a few light bulbs and insulating a few homes. So we are going to have to make do with a lot less. There's a long tail here. There's blue all the way out to there, but it's a long tail at a very, very low level. So we have a long way to go in terms of making the adjustment that is going to be required of us to cope with this scenario. So as a very similar graph to the one you saw earlier on today, very, very fleeting moment in human history is the hydrocarbon age. Prior to that, we were living the way Dr. Tainter was talking about in the Roman Empire, and worse than that in various periods of time as well. Beyond that, again, no fossil fuel inheritance, primarily because the net energy has fallen to below 1. So you may still have the energy under the surface of the earth, but you can't get it anymore. It's no longer an energy source as far as you're concerned. So however long this tail might be, and it might be a couple of hundred years, it's at a very, very low level. So to look a little bit more at the prospects for renewables, it's wonderful. Renewables are wonderful in private applications. I have solar panels in my back field. I have a battery bank in my basement. I'm very pleased to have those. That's good for me. It doesn't do anything to run society. Most of the applications that we are currently using renewable energy in are of that kind that serves the private sphere rather than the public sphere. And that is a very important concept. If we want to increase the amount of renewable energy that we are using to run our society, we have to start using it in the public sphere, not simply having private individuals put solar panels on their own roofs, as useful as that is for them. I mean, my panels aren't even grid tied. So, that is a purely private application. And even if I had grid tied them, the amount that I would ever have been able to provide to the grid would have been infinitesimally small. So we need to think in terms of renewable energy in the public sector. But the minute you do that, the minute you talk about bringing renewable energy into the public sector and using it more widely than simply where you produce it, then you have a grid dependence instantly. And there is a tremendous mismatch of renewable energy resource intensity, demand, and grid capacity. In other words, we have renewable energy potential, but it isn't where we need energy, and if we're going to get it from where it is to where we need it, we have a grid dependency. There's been a just chronic underinvestment in the grid for a very, very long period of time. Our grids, a lot of the equipment is at or near the end of its design life now. Much of it would have to be replaced simply to continue doing what we currently do. And if we're going to ask grids to do different things, like to aggregate very, very distributed energy sources, that is going to take a monumental amount of investment. We have a feed-in tariff program in Ontario, and the available grid capacity in the entire province was oversubscribed during the launch period for this program. So anyone who hasn't already got an offer to connect will now have to wait for grid build out. Most of the projects in Ontario that people got so excited about are going to die long before there's any grid capacity available to actually connect them, which is very sad because a lot of people got really fired up about this, designed all sorts of projects, and the grid capacity simply is not there. The entire grid capacity for Ontario was about 2,500 megawatts. It was pathetic compared to what people were proposing to do with it. But we are going to have a hard time with grids. I worked in grids for a number of years in Ontario, so this issue is something I'm intimately familiar with, and we really need to live in the real world when it comes to what we can hope for renewable energy to do. And we are going to have a lot of problems, primarily with transport. I mean, you saw in a previous presentation that the transport graph for oil consumption, for instance, was huge. And transport primarily relies on liquid fuels. Renewable energy liquid fuels have the lowest net energy of all renewable applications. So we are going to have to think a lot about transport. And for people who think we're all going to go out and buy electric cars, we don't have the production capacity, we do not have the infrastructure, and we're not going to have the time or the money to create either one. So we are not going to be all driving electric cars. We're far more likely to be riding bicycles and walking. So I wanted to move from looking at energy to looking at finance and how the two of them interact at a high level. Energy subsidies drive economic activity, which is not surprising because energy is the physical capacity to do work. If you have a massive energy subsidy, you are very likely to fuel a financial bubble because energy is a major driver of socioeconomic complexity, as we saw, and economic activity. You don't absolutely have to have a massive energy subsidy in order to have a financial bubble, because as we're going to see in a little while, bubbles create virtual wealth, and it takes a lot less energy to create something that isn't really there than to create something that is. So you can have a bubble in the absence of a massive energy subsidy on the scale of fossil fuels. However, if you have a massive energy subsidy, as we have had, the odds of creating a bubble are going to be very, very much higher. And in fact, the fossil fuel era has led to the largest bubble in human history by a very, very wide margin. But the point to note from this is that once you have created a bubble, bubbles have their own internal dynamics. You don't have to then run out of energy for a bubble to simply reach a limit and implode. Finance becomes the primary driver to the downside. You do not have to run out of energy to see a collapse happen. So it fits in with the notion that you complexify yourself out of existence in a way. diminishing marginal returns to complexity are a huge part of what we're going to be seeing. Finance is an incredibly complex activity. I mean, yes, it did get away from regulation, absolutely, as we heard recently, but nevertheless, the scale of complexity in the world of finance has been absolutely staggering, and as that infrastructure breaks down, we are going to see that become a major, major driver to the downside.